Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database. And for the episode today, I want to get into why a school shooting database exists. I think that a lot of people assume that there's really good data from official sources about just about every type of crime or other issues, but ultimately there's not. And that's why the guest today is Dr. Matt Nobles from the University of Central Florida. He is a really prolific writer and researcher. He's published dozens of different papers. And what sets Dr. Nobles apart from a lot of other academics is that he really thinks of himself as a methodologist. And that's somebody that understands intimately how you answer a research question. So Matt, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
So this process of being a methodologist is the first thing that I'd like to talk about, because with any sort of academic endeavor, our focus has been primarily on crime. You think about a research question, and from that research question, you have to find data. And if there's not official crime data, then you need to find some other way to collect that data. That transitions into data analysis. Then you have to decide if the measures are valid or not. You know, did you ultimately collect the data you needed, and does it line up with the research question that you're trying to answer? So can you talk to me about some of these crime data projects that you've worked on?
It's a great question. The contrast that you're drawing about being a generalist is an interesting one, I think, because academics increasingly are sort of in an ecosystem that I think prioritizes and rewards specialization. To a great extent, we market ourselves as academics as a subject matter expert on a particular thing, or sometimes in a particular, sort of domain. So if you were an expert on, the French Revolution, you could speak to many different aspects of that, probably have written many things about it and so on. But being a generalist is, in some ways, I like to use the analogy to compare it to being like the head chef in a really outstanding restaurant, as contrasted with, being the person who braises meat or bakes pastries. A methodologist has to really understand all parts of the research process. They have to be sort of immediately able to pivot to a change in emphasis, a change in subject matter. And moreover, a generalist is usually expected to be highly collaborative and to work with different teams of people who are working on different types of research, different emphasis that could range all the way from theory testing to, policy or program evaluation. So within the scope of what criminology and criminal justice as an academic discipline represents, there's a great deal of opportunity if you are a skilled and productive generalist and methodologist. You really have the opportunity, I think, to add value to almost anything. You're expected to sort of maintain a skill set where you're a good writer and usually qualified as a quantitative analyst and things of that nature. But, I personally find it to be very interesting because I'm never really sure what's going to walk through my door. Sometimes it's a topic related to domestic violence or stalking. Other times it's a crime mapping, project, and other times it's a test of some theory. So that keeps it very interesting.
So I want to get into one of your very first projects because I think it has a lot of parallels to the K-12 school shooting database. When I started this project in 2018, I assumed that I could call the FBI and get a list of every shooting that took place on a campus. It turned out that data doesn't exist at the federal level, at the state level, really at the local level. The only place that it exists is within higher education. Since 2000, the Clery Act has mandated that colleges report a number of different crime categories, but that didn't even exist. And I think one of your first projects was around data collection for crime data on college campuses.
That's right. Starting in graduate school, my colleagues and I were very interested in, staking out many of the elements that you just identified. The lack of data standardization is something that when you really, take in the scope of that and the implications of it, is disquieting. It's stunning to believe that the enterprise exists in higher education without some anticipation of the need for this and some standardization of effort to try to marshal those types of data resources. But that's not, as you alluded to, unique to higher education. It's something that extends out to really every level of any domain that we might consider to be informed by having greater access to and greater standardization of crime incident data of any type. I mean, at the most extreme level, you have, your homicides and your firearm type crimes and so forth. But, honestly, that could inform any number of different, civil or regulatory domains too. It could be crimes against the environment. It could be, insurance adjusting and property values. It could be anything. And so that's kind of where we kind of began the project that you're alluding to is we wanted to try to take the best effort from each of these different data sources, combine as many data sources as we could, and really help triangulate that phenomenon. So we began by assembling these disparate sources of data, lining them up the best way that we could in terms of the definitions of crime and plotting them in a GIS space to sort of see what we could see. We didn't have necessarily a very solid a priori type of hypothesis about what we would find. But as it turned out, we found a number of very interesting things that was worthy publication on its own and informed later projects as well.
And what were some of those findings?
Well, among other things, when we plotted these different sources of crime data and crime adjacent data, we're able to sort of look at the contrast between crimes that occurred technically, officially on campus, which would be subject to the Clery Act reporting procedures that are outlined from Department of Education, et cetera. But we're able to contrast that with what happens just over the boundaries of campus. And as it turns out in the example that we were pursuing in that particular case, when you look just beyond campus in a span of 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, sort of progressive, but not extensive, buffering outward of the campus footprint, you find substantial numbers of crimes that are happening important to the campus context, but not officially on campus. And so one of our arguments in one of the papers that my colleagues and I published, in essence, is that when you look at the Clery Act reporting in isolation, it's telling you a story that is consistent with policy and procedure, reporting practices, et cetera. It's not intentionally disingenuous, but it is perhaps incomplete and lacking in context. So we identified that contrast, for example. We were also able, using data that we were able to get with the cooperation of the University Registrar's Office, to identify patterns of student crime versus non-student. So one of the issues about student safety and on-campus environments and so on is really the notion that if a student that goes to college is going to stay safe, it's really about keeping campus safe. And ultimately, one of the things that we're able to show with that data empirically is students are not confined to campus all the time, and students are quite happy to drift out. Yeah,
I've gotten questions since the K through 12 school shooting database came out in 2018 about what are the numbers for higher education. And the reason that I've never tried to figure out higher education shootings is because exactly what you said, that boundary of the campus is so difficult to define, where you can say definitively a K through 12 school ends here and you don't have anybody living there, which makes it quite a bit easier, but you also don't have people living right around the borders of it, because at a university, you have private housing that's exclusively for students. You have housing that's a mix of students. You have campus offices or classrooms or extension campuses that are in other buildings or shared with other buildings. So is a shooting outside in the hallway or the parking garage of a building that has 2 floors that are owned by your school, is that a campus shooting? What if it involves students? What if both of those people left the class and immediately shot each other? Is that more or less of a shooting than if you have 100,000 people on your campus for a football game. Most of them are non-students, but there's a shooting that's there physically on your campus. And what if you're playing in the Fiesta Bowl and you have everybody at a NFL arena in a different state, but there's a shooting where every single victim is a student? There are just these impossible questions around campuses, higher education, that just makes it so difficult to try to define and understand crime at them. I mean, the one example, the Borderland mass shooting at the Grill in Southern California, that was during college student night, and almost all the victims there were college students. But that's a private bar that's in no way affiliated with the university. Do you count that or do you not? But that's something that impacts college students where they were targeted.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you start factoring in some important differences in the scope of possible contexts too. We tend to, when you say to someone college campus, they have, this picture in their mind of what that looks like. And that tends to reflect kind of a college town, a more or less suburban sort of lifestyle, a relatively smaller type of environment, et cetera. But, in an urban metropolis, like you alluded to, campus, quote unquote, is represented by a couple of floors of a building, and the problems change, the problems of reporting, the problems of, maintaining, sort of a consistent application of policy and ensuring that employees are trained the right way, and all of the other downstream sorts of considerations, flow from that. So you're absolutely right. And I agree as a methodologist, completely with the thesis of your argument that you're presented often with these very difficult to answer, very challenging questions of where should reporting begin and end. Whose responsibility is it to look into the circumstances and or make the decision about whether a given incident falls into a certain kind of category. And it's frustrating, as a scholar, to not be able to sort of go to a ready-made resource that has outlined not necessarily all possible, incidents that could fall under that criteria, but at least a consistent set of rules that get applied.
Because you're wrong no matter where you draw the boundaries with different definitions. The K through 12 school shooting database is anytime a gun is fired or bullet hits school property or gun is brandished with the intent. And that got added because as I was looking through cases in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there were hostage standoffs at schools. Some of them lasted for 6 or 8 or 10 hours, but a shot was never fired. So if you have a peacefully resolved hostage situation, that shouldn't be a zero. That shouldn't be something that's just discarded from the data set. So you have to start thinking about other ways to be able to include this. But then once you do include those, immediately that opens a data set up for criticism to say, well, this includes all these non-shootings. Fortunately, if you understand Excel, if you understand how data is coded, even if you use Stata, you can really include and exclude variables really easily from a ready-made set. What's hard is taking the time to do all of the research. So my philosophy as a researcher has always been collect as much data as possible, code it in as many different ways as possible, make that code book and methodology completely transparent to all of your users. And it takes 3 seconds to delete 100 rows in Excel. It takes 3 days to try to find all the information that it would take to input those rows. So from there, just kind of moving away from college campuses, this is a much bigger problem in studies of crime and criminology and even policing, is that we don't have good federal, state official data on crime. And I know that you've run across that throughout your career. What are some of your theories about where the breakdowns are and why we don't have crime data in the way that a layperson would expect it to exist?
That's an outstanding question, and something of a philosophical one. I think we could probably, point to any number of, practical on the ground reasons that would get offered first by the various stakeholders to explain why there is not a greater or more comprehensive or more successful effort to standardize. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of man hours, and but ultimately, much like many things in this space dealing with gun policy and matters concerning the same subject matter, it's ultimately the political will that is going to be the point where things pivot. There's a great deal of history, a great deal of perhaps reticence on the part of one state to the next in identifying, are we going to look worse, in terms of how we address this problem compared to our neighbors or compared to the typical, points of comparisons, other states, other cities, whatever it might be. And a great deal of reputational sort of pride often hinges on questions like that. You would think, going back to our earlier conversation, that ultimately standardization ought to be the kind of the loftiest goal, because that's, as a consumer of that information, whether I'm a citizen or whether I'm a scholar using it for research purpose, ultimately that's what I'm kind of expecting. I would like to believe that no one is asleep at the wheel, that someone's looking after these types of questions. But as it turns out, that's far less important for any particular state in terms of how it operates its budget or how it, operates during a legislative session or whatever it might be. It's far less important to them to have standardized data to compare to other states than it is for us as scholars or as consumers of that information.
Well, let's talk about that process, because I think this was something that I didn't realize until a couple of years ago, is how complicated it actually is to build a nationwide data set around crimes. So the Uniform Crime Report sets up a set of criteria that crime within these categories need to be reported at the state level, and then that's passed up to the federal government. But a state police officer, a state law enforcement agency, is probably not the one that deals with most crime. Almost all crime is something local that's dealt with by one of the 30,000 different municipal police departments in the country. So if a rape or a shooting or a robbery or something occurs, it first needs to be called into the police, because if somebody's a victim but they never report it, there's not going to be somebody to generate that report in the first place. That's this dark figure of crime that we don't even know about. But then you have to have your local officer come out. They need to assess the situation. They need to interpret that situation, take the information that they have gathered at the scene there, put it into a report, document it correctly in that report. That report needs to then be filed somehow in that local police department. Somebody there needs to take that data, make sure that it fits whatever you need for your state reporting, transmit that information to the state. Then at the state, they need to take these things that are coming in from thousands of different police departments, probably in all different formats, collate that all into one state wrap-up. Now, with each one of those lines of data entry or every single spreadsheet that's getting combined, there's a huge opportunity for errors. Something could be miscoded, something could be missed, something could be double entered or triple entered or quadruple entered, or not entered at all. And once all of that data is worked out at the state level, then it gets sent up to the FBI. And now you have data from 50 different states and territories in various conditions of completeness, all being processed and turned into one uniform national crime report. How many different problems have you seen in that UCR data when you've dug into it?
Well, the UCR is and has been for many years sort of regarded as the most consistently available standardized source for data of this type. But as you're alluding to, there's an enormous process, that sort of funnel metaphor. No doubt human error plays a part. And usually that's at the lowest levels of the observation of a particular, element of that incident, or the designation of that as being a certain type as opposed to another similar type. And those types of things can manifest downstream. But as a scholar who might be interested in examining the relative importance of different factors that are present in an incident that the police are aware of and responding to, it's frustrating to understand that the UCR really lacks that kind of detail. So the FBI has moved now to the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS. But the problem with NIBRS, even though it represents a richer overall data set, is that it exponentially accelerates many of the problems that you're alluding to. The consistency of reporting, the compatibility between systems, even the agency level participation in the NIBRS program have all become apparent in the last few years as being major, huge issues that are going to impact how much trust we have in the results that come out of the NIBRS system.
And I believe there are 2 states that have opted out of providing NIBRS data. So that's the other thing when we have this federalist organization where states in a lot of ways are their sovereign entities within this country. The federal government can't really compel a state to provide them with certain types of information in certain ways. You can connect it to grant funding, you can connect it to other programs. But if a state doesn't want to give you crime data, or doesn't want to give you crime data in certain categories, or wants to portray some problems as different from others, then all of a sudden you have just a really convoluted collection of information that ultimately our policy gets based on. Because I think that that's where data collection projects like the school shooting database, like your campus crime data, lots of efforts to address these dark figures of crime that aren't collected by official sources, are all thinking about really important policy decisions. Like, what are we going to do for campus safety? Are we going to arm a teacher? Are we going to have a special tax that goes towards retrofitting every one of our buildings with bulletproof glass? Are we going to change this policy around education of college students? Each one of those things usually comes out of state or federal mandate. But if people don't understand the real data, the real situation behind those crimes, they might be making policies that are either counterproductive or even harmful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you alluded to, I think the good news, the silver lining in the lack of standardization and experiencing many of the problems that we've talked about is, there is an increasingly resourceful and quite motivated grassroots effort out there on many different fronts to try to assemble the types of data that would inform any number of policy type questions and even beyond that, into, conceptual and theoretical types of matters if we're talking about sort of the pure research angle to it. But that is an exciting aspect of what it is to be a scholar at this particular time in history when, the growth and the advancement and utility of tools like AI is starting to become, something that it doesn't just exist on the fringes. It becomes kind of part of the mainstream conversation. Like, well, how can we use AI to really help make this complete or to address the gaps in what we know about it?
Yeah, one of the things that I found really difficult through the process of relying on individual research centers, individual universities, special interest groups, grassroots projects, individual journalism projects. I think of the Washington Post created the police killing database because there was not a good way to analyze exactly how many fatal shootings police officers were committing every year. And then that has been something that has actually driven a lot of follow-up policy and research. But the issue with that is when you have NIBRS data, when you have UCR data, it's a federal agency that's responsible. It's the FBI. It's the Department of Justice. When you have a group of researchers or a single researcher who's at the head of a data collection, all of the problems that exist in every single data collection effort, because you can't do this perfectly, become directed at just one individual. And that becomes a huge burden for a person to bear. A university may not want to get into a really controversial data collection project because that university's counsel may be worried about the lawsuits that could come from it, the poor press exposure. I mean, we need to get data about the hardest issues, the most controversial issues in our society if we're going to address them. How do you think we move forward in ways that can make this information come together?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question. First of all, I agree with everything that you said. I mean, these are interesting times for higher education. We're starting to reach a point in our profession where people are increasingly up against political issues and pressures and expectations, perhaps that have not really been, at the forefront of our consideration as scholars certainly for many decades. What we do about that, I think, is remains to be seen. Institutionally, I think it's the onus remains on those of us who have the protection of tenure and are willing to use that voice and that platform to sort of steer institutional governance, into the right decision-making process, or to at least consider, all of the various factors that need to be taken into consideration, so that the perspective of pure science and the objectivity of our findings and a variety of other related concerns are protected. As far as what we do, as a culture, as a nation, as a world, in confronting these types of problems, I think it needs to be the case that people develop a familiarity not just with the questions, but with the skill sets, with the procedures, with the approaches, that are going to support those kinds of inquiries. So, an example of this is data fluency. Data fluency is not unique to scholarship and to researchers and people with PhDs. You could be a coder, you could be an app developer, you could be, just an average person, but to understand what data is, what it means, how it becomes into being and how it changes over time, et cetera, is sort of, the genesis of many of these different problems. What sort of reporting procedures and policies and agencies and individuals and stakeholders and all those kinds of things are adjacent to that. But the point that I think I'm trying to make is the more awareness we have out there, the more people can look at that and say, well, wait a minute, here's an opportunity. What if we just made a record of that? What if we looked at that? That's going to help all of us.
I think people miss that, in that, what does data mean? Because for a lot of people, data means nerd. Data means a ton of numbers. But data at its heart is just taking information and putting it into a more usable format. So if I have 10 news stories about school shootings, I can read them all and hopefully memorize them, and maybe I can write a paper about them. But if I take those 10 stories and from each one, I put the date into a column, and I put a time into the column, and the number of people that were injured or killed in another column, and the relationship of the shooter to the school, the circumstances of why they committed the shooting, what weapon they used. All of a sudden, you're taking this information that was available to you, and you're just transforming it into a way that it can be used in lots of different ways. Because now that we have dates, we can tell the number by year. Now that we have the times, we can start looking at patterns. Once you know the affiliation of the shooter, you can see even more patterns. Then you start combining these things, and you see from the 70s to the 80s, the shooter was an outsider. But from the 90s and the aughts and the 2010s, the shooter was a student at the school. We now have a time series set of data, and we also have two different patterns to compare to each other. And that's, I think, the beauty of data literacy that you're talking about. And I hope that it's something that makes its way more into K through 12 curriculums, is we have so much information in the world. But if you want to find patterns in that data, you've got to put it into a usable format. And that's what data literacy and data science and being a methodologist is all about.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, and I think, one challenge that we confront particularly in our academic discipline here, is people have endless opinions, endless perspectives on what crime is, what's happening to it, where it comes from, what we should do about it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with opinion, but opinion is not always the basis for excellent policy. And the difference between someone's opinion, I think this person did this because they're evil. I think this person did it because of, fill in the blank, any number of possible explanations, that they're tying that opinion, that perspective to something that they've seen or experienced themselves. The difference between that and having a factual basis that says, well, we looked at that element and we can rule that out for the following reasons. Or perhaps even better, as opposed to that explanation, this other explanation offers, greater explanatory power. We learn more from identifying the association in time and space, for example, than we do in, just regarding people as evil or unhinged or psychotic or whatever it might be, and, kind of marginalizing that. So I think most people would agree that we would prefer to have crime policy based on actual observable facts. And that's what data is representing. And that's true of not just the crime incidents themselves, but it's true of a variety of different elements that might be associated with that. Guns are an incredibly controversial, sort of source of data collection and problems and obstacles. But that's a great example of, the more that we know about that and the more that we're able to bring to bear as far as information, the better position we're going to be in.
Well, it comes down to kind of a fundamental point, and you have to do this in academia a lot, but there's a need to be polite to everyone. And this concept that everybody is entitled to their opinion on a matter, is prevalent throughout the media and social media and academic discourse. But if you have an opinion that runs contrary to the facts, it's wrong. Your opinion is wrong. And unfortunately, without data, people have been able to create platforms around incorrect opinions, ultimately to the detriment of students and the detriment to the taxpayers. One of the things that I've seen pop up over the last couple of years, and I love this because it's rooted in criminology, is the idea that environmental design of a campus can be something that deters a school shooter. Now, that sounds great on paper. That is a great opinion to say we can design away crime. And then you look back to Clark's routine activities theory in 1979. He got empirical evidence. So he got data about residential burglaries. And when he looked at residential burglaries, he found that if you changed factors like the height of the shrubs around a building, that might make it less attractive to a burglar. People took that, as they do in academia, and tried to replicate it to other types of crimes. And in multiple studies of violent crime, there has been no evidence that supports environmental design changes having any impact on violent crime. As we know with homicides, they're almost always people that are related to each other. School shooters are almost always current or former students that have planned the attack for days, months, or even years because of a direct grievance with the school. The height of the bushes has nothing to do with how pissed they are about some trauma that they experienced in that building 3 years ago. The height of the bushes of your house isn't going to make a former spouse not come back there and kill you. It might stop a burglar. So if schools have burglary problems, then routine activities theory might help them with that. But when people misapply evidence, when people take parts of theories and they don't test it against empirical data, we end up wasting millions of dollars on campuses that are designed around a theory that's for property crime. And those are dollars that are not going into education. Those are dollars that are not going into other places. But unless you take the time to understand these academic theories, how they're supported, how they're not supported, then anybody can claim an opinion. It's up to us to show that evidence that some of this stuff is just nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm in complete agreement with the notion of contrasting, opinion and facts could not be more essential to making well-reasoned arguments in policy. And I think, unfortunately, the message gets convoluted because people tend to persist in their belief about their perspective, their experience, their opinion, and they are indeed entitled to have an opinion, but they are not necessarily co-equals as far as drafting, shaping, maintaining policy, law, etc. When they're not informed, when they're not equipped, with the actual facts of the case, And I think the appeal of things like, as you're alluding to, the environmental design elements of crime prevention is that it's very linear. It's very easy to understand the connection between just tell me how much I have to spend on this thing. We'll make sure that we spend it. Someone out there says that it's beneficial or that it might be. Fine, I'm sold. As an administrator, as a police chief, I'm not denigrating the positions of those individuals, but there is a motivation always, even a desirable characteristic of resourcefulness, to be on the lookout. Well, if we could do these things, wouldn't we want to do them? Yes, we absolutely would want to do any of those things if they're available as part of the toolkit. But also, as you allude to, it's not going to be a panacea. It's not going to eliminate all possible problems. It's not going to even eliminate many of the most difficult, the most vexing ones. And a lot of these problems really are complicated. People don't want to believe in that. They want to believe in a simplistic explanation. This person did this because they're an evil person, or this person did this because of mental illness, or whatever it might be. The realities are much more complicated. And, we should be on the lookout for policy and, approaches to application, that are simplistic when those things might be available. But we should also anticipate it's unlikely that those kinds of solutions are going to eliminate every possible challenge.
Yeah, I think that's probably the point that we just close this conversation on today, is that crime in general, crime in any context, whether it's gun violence in a K through 12 school, whether it's sexual assaults on a college campus, whether it's crimes occurring in a local jurisdiction, these are all connected to a really complex set of different circumstances. There's no simplistic solution that solves any of them. Unfortunately, there's no simple way to collect the data on them. But if we don't make some effort to collect this data, do it in a purposeful, uniform way, and make it accessible in either real time or short order to people that can understand the patterns and trends and what they're seeing in this information, so that that can drive policy decisions, then we can be basing our different interventions, our different policies on information instead of assumptions. That's the biggest piece, I think, that academics and this process and the process of being an academic methodologist, rooting your research in data collection, in analysis, in measurement, and verifications of validity is a path forward to a much safer country. So, Dr. Nobles, I'd like to thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and I'm privileged to be able to join you today.
All right. Well, Matt Nobles is a professor of criminal justice at the University of Central Florida, a prolific author, and I will put his LinkedIn page in the show notes if you want to contact him and complain about any of the content today. So this was the Back to School Shooting Podcast. Thank you very much for listening.